The history of modern Central Asia is dominated by the Soviet Union and the legacy it left after its collapse in 1991. Of the republics that emerged, varying degrees of stability ensued, with authoritarian regimes coming to the forefront. But this process was notable for how peaceful the transition was. Except in one of the new republics, perhaps the one most often forgotten about, Tajikistan. I'm your host David, and in a continuation of our last video where we looked at the place and position of the Tajik SSR in the Soviet period, today we are going to look at the outbreak of war in the fragile and divided republic. This is the post-Cold War. Okay, so in our last video we explored how Tajik citizens had staged widespread protests in February 1990 in the capital Dushanbe against the Soviet government amid anger about the economy and living standards. In response, Moscow had dispatched soldiers to quell the unrest and subsequently shooting and killing 25 protesters. Fueled by dissatisfaction, the fragmentation of Tajik politics along regional lines, and Gorbachev's glasnost policy, the republic's various clans had also started organizing themselves into political parties during the 1980s. These included the Socialist Party of Tajikistan, the Islamic Renaissance Party, Lali Badakhshan, and the Democratic Party of Tajikistan, to name a few, and all had had very different ideas about how Tajikistan should be run and who should run it. Following a presidential election in November 1991, however, the former Soviet leader of Tajikistan, Rakhmat Nabiev, had emerged victorious with 60.44% of the vote, but the deep divisions in Tajik society had not gone anywhere. So the question was if there was any way Nabiev could rally Tajikistan's various regional factions behind him and form a functioning state. Given the topic at hand, you have probably figured that any sentiment that Nabiev and the opposition might have been able to work together did not last long. This was largely due to Nabiev's own ineptitude as leader. Nabiev was from Khujand, so he immediately appointed members of the northern clans to most of the key positions in government. This, of course, did nothing to mitigate the opposition's concerns, or indeed any reservations held by the southern Kolobi clan. Relatedly, Nabiev made no effort to form coalitions and instead expected citizens to subordinate themselves to his leadership as they had done during Soviet times. He simultaneously cracked down on the opposition, but this had the effect of further solidifying their unity against him. Perhaps the biggest issue, though, was that Nabiev was simply a lazy leader who did not make any effort to fix Tajikistan's problems, so any popular support he had quickly waned. Nabiev's former chief of staff, Karim Abdulov, later commented, quote, "Nobody worked with us. The president did not have time. The vice president met with our officers once, and that was it. Every counselor and advisor worked on his own problems. Weekly briefings were deemed unnecessary by the president. Most meetings of the president took place without preparation. Eventually, the traffic of visitors began to be controlled by the group of Anatoly Omoyov, Nabiev's longtime bodyguard. Day by day, Omoyov and his friends' clients poured in to talk with the president. However, government officials who wanted to discuss issues of state importance did not have a hope of being given an audience. After months of Nabiev's leadership, Tajikistan thus remained a mess, and for a growing number of people, even those who had initially sided with Nabiev, there was no reason to support him. By spring 1992, Dushanbe once again played host to widespread civil unrest as opposition supporters gathered in the capital and demanded that Nabiev turn his attention from purging to the unignorable issues facing the Tajik people. By April 12th, over 50,000 protesters were situated in Shaidan Square alone. A week later, on April 19th, Nabiev issued an ultimatum to the protesters that they would face drastic measures if they did not leave the square by the next morning, but no such measures materialized. Nabiev's inaction only encouraged the protesters further, and by the end of the month, there were over 100,000 protesters in Dushanbe. In the meantime, on April 10th, leaders in Gorno-Badakhshan had declared their region an autonomous republic with little consequence. This prompted leaders in Garm to follow suit a couple of weeks later. By late April 1992, then, both the government and the opposition had reached a stalemate. Nabiev lacked the authority of material to crush the rebellions against him, while the opposition and region leaders were in no mood to compromise. Still, Nabiev did have one more ace left up his sleeve. On April 30th, he introduced direct presidential rule in the hope that he could unify the entire state apparatus against the opposition. To say this proved too little too late, however, would be a massive understatement. He was simply ignored, and instead a hasty arms race followed as Tajikistan's various elite factions began recruiting troops from regional collective farms. Nabiev armed government loyalists with whatever weapons he could find, which mostly consisted of outdated Soviet equipment that had been left in Tajikistan following the USSR's collapse. He was also forced to call on the southern Kulobi clan to formally support him in a coalition. Opposition leaders likewise armed themselves with old Soviet equipment. For their part, the Islamic Renaissance Party, or IRP, established contacts with Mujahideen forces in neighboring Afghanistan seeking military aid. Days later, on May 5th, Nabiev put in place a state of emergency, and security forces loyal to Nabiev fired the first shots on protesters on the outskirts of Dushanbe. Tajikistan was now almost split in two, with other pockets of opposition in Garm, north of Khujand on the Uzbek border, and in Dushanbe. The Tajik Civil War had begun. Of course, Tajikistan's collapse into anarchy did not go unnoticed by the international community, and it will surprise no one that Russia was among the first players to get involved. When the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belovezha Accords on December 8, 1991, and effectively dissolved the Soviet Union, they also agreed that they would establish the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS. Serving as something akin to a cross between NATO and the EU, the CIS aimed to encourage collaboration between the former Soviet republics, not only in trade, but with a particular interest in security matters, including peacekeeping and military affairs. Tajikistan had joined the CIS on December 21, 1991, so the organization therefore had an obligation to intervene. And Russia, as by far the most powerful member of the alliance, would play a leading role. Thus, as soon as war broke out on May 5th, CIS military officers demanded that the two sides negotiate and forced Nabiev's government into a fragile compromise with the opposition. The result of the negotiations was publicly announced on May 7th and amounted to a complete humiliation. Nabiev was forced to dismiss several key allies in government, disband the National Guards, lift the state of emergency, cede his personal power over government appointments, lift restrictions on political parties and media, and hold fresh parliamentary elections in December later that year. Nabiev and the opposition had seemingly reached an agreement, but was it enough? Well, Nabiev's capitulation had destroyed any remaining authority that he had, so the opposition now saw an opportunity to oust him completely. In the days that followed, the emboldened anti-Nabiev camp took to the streets of Dushanbe once again, this time focusing their efforts on the National Security Committee building where Nabiev was taking refuge. The result was another 10 deaths, as government forces opened fire on protesters, prompting most of the remaining opposition to flee Dushanbe to join up with regional militias that were forming. Government loyalists would soon adopt the moniker Popular Front of Tajikistan, or PFT, and following the failure of the CIS's compromise on May 7th, Nabiev formally requested Russian military assistance. With Russia occupied with other conflicts in places like Abkhazia, Transnistria, and Nagorno-Karabakh, however, military support did not yet prove forthcoming. The most violent fighting of the Civil War took place in 1992 and 1993. PFT forces struggled to gain or maintain a significant foothold, and during the course of the summer of 1992, opposition forces quickly gained the upper hand. Ethnic cleansing became commonplace, with Garmis expelled from the Kulob region. In turn, Kulobis were forced out of Garm and Korong Tepe. This would be a recurring theme throughout the war. In the summer of 1992 alone, over 100,000 Uzbeks and Kulobis were forced from their homes, and in December 1993, for example, 71 civilians were murdered in the village of Sumbulak by government forces in just one day. As summarized by Doug Foster, quote, "The violent competition for power quickly turned into a murderous spree of identity-targeted killing performed by informal units led by radicalized leaders who advocated and implemented increasingly more violent actions towards their adversaries." By early September 1992, opposition factions had completely taken Dushanbe and occupied key government buildings, leaving PFT forces isolated in Khujand and Kulob. Deeply alarmed, the Russian garrison in Tajikistan brokered an agreement between Nabiev's government and the Kulobi clans, which enabled the Kulobis to formally enter government. Shortly after, on September 7th, the opposition captured Nabiev at Dushanbe's airport and forced him to resign at gunpoint. The day after Nabiev's capture, CIS members, Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, formally joined the war in support of the PFT, which was now led by Akbarsho Iskandarov, who assumed the role of acting president. The events of September 1992 set in motion two pivotal developments which would define the trajectory of the rest of the Civil War. The first, of course, was the formal entry of foreign powers into the conflict. The most instrumental players were Uzbekistan and Russia, with Uzbek President Islam Karimov allowing the Russians to use the headquarters of the GRU's former 15th Army in his country as the key base of command for CIS forces. On the one hand, Karimov was motivated by his deep concerns about the spread of radical Islam in Central Asia, and on the other hand, he wanted to protect the roughly 20% of Tajikistan's population that were ethnic Uzbeks. Karimov appealed to the UN on September 8th for assistance with regard to the latter, and following a second appeal for help by Tajik President Iskandarov, on September 29th, the UN established a mission in Tajikistan in late October. The second key development following the events of early September 1992 concerned the CIS-backed deal to bring the Kulobis into government. Shortly after, in November 1992, President Iskandarov, along with the entire government and the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, submitted a joint resignation, paving the way for the formation of a new government. But who would lead this new government, and how could they establish anything feasible when the opposition still controlled most of Tajikistan's territory? Such were the questions that faced the 16th session of the Supreme Soviet of Tajikistan in mid-November, when they met in Khujand, far from the violence taking place in the south. With negotiations eased by the presence of 24 field commanders from all sides, officials decided to abolish the position of the president. Instead, Tajikistan would be a parliamentary republic, with an elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet. This created a new conundrum: who would be the chairman? During the same session, the relatively unknown Emomali Rakhmanov, a former people's deputy from Kulob, was elected on a vote of 186 to 11 as the man who would lead the new Tajik government. At the time, he was widely considered a weak leader who had simply been put in power as a placeholder by the more powerful militia forces that had brokered the deal. But none of this really mattered. The CIS had, at the very least, a stable Kulobi-Khujandi coalition they could work with. Considerable economic and military support followed, and by December 1992, the PFT was backed by an 8,000-strong force of pro-government local militias and mostly Russian CIS forces with a unified chain of command. With the Tajik government now strengthened both militarily and politically, PFT forces were well poised to take back control of Dushanbe, and they did exactly that. On December 10th, CIS forces entered Tajikistan with the primary goal of securing the southern border with Afghanistan to stop the flow of weapons to opposition forces from the Mujahideen. Backed by Uzbek air support, the PFT captured Dushanbe with relative ease and forced the opposition into the center and east of the country. As shown on this map, the Tajik government now controlled the entire west of the country, which crucially encompassed the administrative centers of Khujand, Kulob, and Dushanbe. Although we can see that even after the CIS's intervention, the opposition controlled most of the physical territory of Tajikistan, this did not matter. As we highlighted in our previous video, the overwhelming majority of Tajikistan's population, industry, and political institutions were based in the west, so the government could pretty much operate without controlling all of the physical territory. Still though, the PFT had failed to secure the entire southern border, so following the opposition's defeat in Dushanbe, it deepened ties with Afghanistan and began operating under the umbrella of the United Tajik Opposition, or UTO, from early 1993. Fighting continued into 1993 as PFT forces liquidated around 1,000 Garmis and Pamiris from Dushanbe, and a further 200,000 fled either east or to Afghanistan. In July, the replenished UTO launched a counter-offensive from Afghanistan in an attempt to capture areas southwest of Kulob, but they were again easily defeated. The PFT continued to gain momentum as the newly formed Tajik government signed an agreement on friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with Russia on May 25, 1993, and in June the Supreme Court of Tajikistan formally banned opposition parties following pressure from Tashkent. Nevertheless, subsequent UN-backed peace talks in June of 1994 did little to quell the sporadic eruption of rural warfare, and a temporary UN-brokered ceasefire in October 1995 only provided regional militias with an opportunity to rearm. Meanwhile, Rachmanov had been working behind the scenes to expel any early assumptions that he was merely a puppet leader. He increasingly appointed figures from his native Kulob region to key positions, and in 1994, the presidency was reinstated with presidential elections to be held on November 6th. Safeguarded by another temporary ceasefire signed in September, Rachmanov won fairly comfortably in a process that was, unsurprisingly, neither free nor fair. However, in the build-up to the election, Rachmanov had become concerned about the potential fifth column of the Uzbek minority and the Hissoris to the west of Dushanbe. He therefore created the new southern district of Fatland to create an alternative power base, securing 99.5% of the district's vote in the election. Following this, Russia sent Rachmanov's government 15 billion rubles, which enabled him to pay government salaries for the first time since independence. Karimov was of course outraged by Rachmanov's move against the Uzbeks, but Rachmanov's gamble paid off and Russia did nothing to stop him. As Jesse Driscoll explains, the president's coalition had withstood a critical challenge and foreign aid had been delivered. In the following 3 years, virtually all Hissori and Uzbek warlords were dismissed or disappeared one at a time. It was not difficult for Rachmanov to convince the dominant Kulobi faction that field commanders from Hissor were a threat to their interests, either a potential fifth column for Uzbek influence in the consolidation state, or as likely allies for a power grab by the embittered Kuchandis. Nevertheless, Rachmanov's apparent success in securing his own position did not change the fact that the Tajik government remained in practice very fragile. A particularly totemic example of this took place in January 1996, when Mahmoud Kudoyberdiev, a half-Uzbek Tajik, led an attempted coup against the government in Khatlon. However, when in August 1996, the opposition launched a renewed offensive against Dushanbe, and the government lost control of Khatlon again in January 1997, following Russia's withdrawal of troops, which they needed to fight in Chechnya, it was fair to say that the CIS had simply had enough. In June 1997, representatives of the government and various warlords from all over Tajikistan traveled to Moscow and signed the Tajik Peace and National Reconciliation Agreement, formally putting an end to the war. The conflict, it seemed, was finally over, and Tajikistan could move forward. But it's worth stepping back for a moment. If the opposition was still launching offensives against the government well into 1997, how did Russia suddenly get everyone to sit down and figure out a peace agreement? Well, in part it was because Rachmanov faced massive international pressure to end the war when the Taliban took over Kabul in 1996, and this undoubtedly encouraged the government to compromise. But this still does not answer the question of what, if anything, there was to compromise on. The answer to this lies largely in the money that had been pouring in from Moscow, which created serious business opportunities for entrepreneurial militia leaders alongside the post-independence privatization of Tajikistan's industries. It's also worth highlighting the porousness of Tajikistan's border with Afghanistan, which had facilitated a flourishing opium trade. By some estimates, the opium trade grew by as much as 2,000% over the course of the Civil War, making certain warlords very wealthy indeed. Given these opportunities, over time the war had therefore increasingly evolved from a conflict over territory and ethnicity to one over control of resources, trade routes, and the powerful regional networks that had characterized Tajikistan's political economy since the Soviet era. Concurrently, regional leaders increasingly realized that the best way to secure their access was not to fight against the government, but to work with it. Therefore, the peace agreement Moscow brokered did not really settle any territorial or ethnic disputes at all. Rather, it formalized and facilitated a patchwork of informal understandings and de facto ceasefires that somehow, when put together, resembled a functional state. Maybe Rachmanov was just the figurehead, after all. Turning back to the content of the agreement itself, the principal compromises were that Rachmanov agreed to assign 30% of the seats in parliament to the opposition and distribute important ministerial posts beyond his native Kulob clan. As such, of the estimated 97 major warlords who emerged at the beginning of the Civil War, 57 accepted positions in Rachmanov's bureaucracy either during the conflict or in 1997. The other 40 warlords who began in 1991 were almost all victims of the fighting, meaning that by 1997 there was fairly universal buy-in. Though a handful simply disappeared or fled the country, the fact that the clear majority of those still active eventually opted to join the government strongly alludes to the informal dealings that belied the peace deal. To again cite Driscoll, in short, Tajikistan's Civil War settlement should not be understood as a peace enforced by Russia, the United Nations, or anyone else. Great power interests and institutional barriers set the chessboard, of course, but the nature of the spoils being contested made robust third-party monitoring impossible. The micro-contours of post-independence redistribution politics hinged on the particulars of land reform, privatization in opaque and closed-bid environments, complex credit swaps cemented via marriages, money laundering across borders, asset price-fixing schemes designed to pass debt on to the next generation, and the like. Informal understandings between armed actors were necessary for enforcement. In any case, fighting in Tajikistan still continued into 1998, even after the Moscow Agreement. Kuraberdiev, the same Kuraberdiev who had rebelled against Rachmanov in Fatland in 1996, launched another rebellion 2 months after the peace deal in protest at the integration of Muslims into the government. The Tajiks subsequently accused Uzbekistan of encouraging the rebellion, and tensions between the two countries reached a nadir from which they have never really recovered, even to the present day. In November 1998, Kuraberdiev led yet another rebellion, this time in Kyrgyzstan, capturing the airport and several key government buildings. A week later, however, government forces recaptured the city, with the battle resulting in the deaths of another 2,000 people. Thankfully for the Tajik people, though, this particular rebellion proved to be the last. Overall, the Tajik Civil War of 1992 to 1997 resulted in the deaths of as many as 150,000 people and displaced a further 1.5 million, undoubtedly making it one of the most violent and prolonged conflicts to emerge in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. What then can we learn about the USSR through the lens of the Tajik Civil War? In our first episode, we explored yet another example of how the shortcomings of the Soviet modernizing project exacerbated regional divisions in states like Tajikistan, where national identity had never existed before. In this episode, though, we shed light on the reasons why so many former Soviet states collapsed into violence in the 1990s. Who were the rightful owners of former state property? What constitutes a nation? Who had the right to govern, and who should decide the structures of a newly independent state? These were the questions that faced ordinary people from Tajikistan to Transnistria in the early 1990s as they transitioned from Soviet rule to independence. Unfortunately, in many cases, the search for answers resulted in blood, and it's not hard to see how the legacies of Soviet governance made the search for answers more complicated. But perhaps the biggest takeaway is that the peace deals which ended, or froze, conflicts in the former USSR were not really peace agreements at all. Rather, they were more often than not a series of fragile pacts and agreements between the beneficiaries of the informality that the Soviet economic model created. Tajikistan today continues to be ruled by the same Emomali Rachmanov, though he has since de-Russified his surname to Rahman. Domestically, however, he is better known as the founder of peace and national unity, leader of the nation. As the moniker suggests, Rahman's regime is deeply authoritarian and a corrupt one, and it has been ever since the 1997 peace agreement. Indeed, by December 2006, just 16 of the 57 warlords who joined the government remained in their posts. Since then, almost all have been purged, while the Islamic Renaissance Party was also banned in 2015. Though Tajikistan remains relatively stable despite sporadic violence in the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Republic, it consistently ranks near the bottom of Transparency International's global corruption rankings. The civil war itself has become a taboo, which is seldom discussed by either the government or the public in general. Its legacy on the structure of the contemporary Tajik state, however, is unignorable. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button. Who has given up being a local warlord to enter government where its corruption can now have official sanction. We would like to extend a special thanks to Michael Hilliard, the host of the outstanding The Red Line podcast, whose insight, resources, and time were given so freely and without which this series would not have been possible. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.